If you want to find Russians in Israel, where do you go? You might start here, in Jerusalem's Russian compound, where the bells are summoning us to celebrate Orthodox Easter. Inside Holy Trinity Cathedral, the incense and the choral harmonies are as dense as anything you'll find in Moscow. And because it's Friday evening, just up the road in Mea Shearim, you'll find another Russia, speaking Yiddish, sporting sidelocks and black gabardines, and looking for all the world like extras in Fiddler on the Roof. What you almost certainly don't expect is this. We're in Tel Aviv's Allenby Street, but you might be forgiven for thinking you were in Yekaterinburg or Pskov. In this supermarket, all the labels are in Cyrillic script. The prices are in shekels, but the chiller cabinets are stuffed with smoked fish, every brand of vodka, and 50 kinds of very unkosher pork sausages. The customers here have nothing to do with the Russian pilgrims who've been visiting the Holy Land since the mid-19th century. They're much more recent arrivals, the products of perestroika, Jews who've been coming to Israel since the late 1970s and who've established a little Moscow in the desert. 40 years ago they were escaping Soviet anti-Semitism. In those days they were called refuseniks. Today there are 1.3 million of them. The Moses who guided them to the Promised Land was the politician Naftali, now Natan Sharansky.
All our struggle in the Soviet Union, we could never survive even one day if it was not supported very actively by the Jews of the world and by all freedom-loving people.
Where was the point at which it no longer became an issue of protest and became an issue of enabling?
President Gorbachev releases me hoping that that will be enough to improve relations. And the pressure continues. We continued the pressure. We were insisting, asking the Western governments not to stop this pressure until the gates of the Soviet Union will be opened. And practically in the end of 1988, the policy of open gates started. At that moment, I can say it was no more the struggle of the protest in order to make the hole in the Iron Curtain, and more like the process of exodus.
Practicing Jews don't speak of immigration to Israel. They talk of making aliyah, going up. The commentator and author Lily Galili is well known to readers of Israel's liberal newspaper Haaretz. She's recently chronicled the checkered story of Israel's new Russian minority.
It was a very strange encounter of myths and broken expectations and too much promises, I think that we should change the name. We are not the promised land, we are the promising land. We promise too much.
Can you describe to me what their experience was like when they realized that the world that they were coming to was going to be so different? How did they deal with it?
For many of them, it was a huge disappointment, starting from very elementary basics. Some of them had no idea there are Arabs in Israel. They knew there were Arabs around Israel, though the more sophisticated ones did know, but they had no idea there were Arabs in Israel. They were looking for the West, and they found themselves in the Orient, totally unexpected. They hated the climate. I know it sounds ridiculous and it's an argument, but it plays a role. I spoke to one very kind of intellectual guy, and he looked at me and he said, Lily, what kind of a culture can develop in a country where you cannot wear a suit for 9 months a year?
When Sharansky founded Israel's Jewish Agency to support the incomers, he didn't just have to deal with culture shock. The biggest challenge was Israel's official language, modern Hebrew.
It was believed that when they come, they have to learn Hebrew language and everything has to be in Hebrew. So when we came with the idea that there must be Russian language radio station for new immigrants, there was a lot of resistance because it was said that if there will be special broadcasting in Russian, they will never learn Hebrew. In fact, we believed that it is old theory. It is already proved that Hebrew is a live language. So for the first time, Russian language radio was created, and Russians speaking TV, which exists until this day. That was absolutely new approach. Second thing, there were some Jewish Russian actors who called me from Moscow and said they want to come, but they want to be sure that I can help them to create theater in Russian. And I was so excited for the idea that these representatives of intelligentsia, Russian Jewish intelligentsia, will come, that it can have positive influence on many other intellectuals who are thinking to come. But the answer was absolutely not. We will never permit you such a thing. It is against all the concept. We didn't permit theater in Romanian, we didn't permit theater in Yiddish, because we are rebuilding Hebrew culture. So I went to the other Jewish capital, New York, to bring these people for a few concerts. And that's how this theater, Gesher, started, which later became one of the most decorated theaters in the history of Israel, and which exists until this day, and there are plays in Hebrew and in Russian.
One of Gesher's shows, Yakish and Pupcha, has a soundtrack from the old country, klezmer, the music of the Tsarist Jewish Pale of Settlement. Gesher is an appropriate name for a Russo-Israeli company. It means bridge in Hebrew. It's run by the general manager, Lena Kreindlin, and the director, Yevgeny Arya.
It was absolutely unique experience, and I don't know any other example when the same company, the same people can perform in two different languages.
Do you do all the rehearsals in Russian and then all the rehearsals in Hebrew?
Right. It's not a problem of director, it's a problem of actors. Can you imagine what kind of mental house they had on their heads? Because from time to time they had to perform today in Russian or vice versa and tomorrow in Hebrew.
I know that in some performance in Russian, when one of the actresses forgot which word to say in Russian, the whole audience tried to help her because she said it in Hebrew, so everybody translated it for her. Now we have half actors in the company, they are Russian-speaking actors, and half they are Hebrew-speaking actors. A lot of people tried to establish theaters in Russian. New immigrants, they came, they wanted to work, to keep their profession, and they failed in short period.
The Israel Philharmonic Orchestra playing the music of one of its founders, Leonard Bernstein. In the late 70s, its ranks were swelled by a host of Russian players. There was a joke at the time. Anyone arriving at Ben Gurion Airport from Moscow who wasn't carrying a fiddle was a pianist. Principal cellist Marcel Bergman immigrated from Leningrad in 1978.
Quite a lot of musicians were on very high professional level. Not everybody got what they thought they would, but no argument that a lot of orchestra got huge influx of highly trained professional musicians. A lot of music schools got very good teachers. Many were forced by different situations to change the job, some successfully, some unsuccessfully. And then people had to learn the language as quickly as possible to find themselves any kind of employment to support the families. Quite a lot of people, I don't know which percentage, maybe between 15 and 20, returned back to Russia.
So one thing Israel couldn't promise was unlimited employment. Lily Galili.
You cannot provide jobs to 1 million people and make them not lose status. No way, it just cannot be. I always think of one example, which is kind of extreme example, but it's very telling. I met a guy who came, I think he was then in his 50s. He was an expert on Siberian trains. What is Israel expected to do with experts on Siberian trains. We don't even have a tube or underground or nothing. What do we do with the expert on Siberian trains? So of course he lost his status, but this is the lost generation in every immigration. And yes, you can see many Russians with high degrees now working as guards and working at parking lots. And you can immediately tell it's a Russian because he's always reading a book. Always. You know for sure he's a Russian. They don't waste a second. But there is always some leftovers, unfortunately, of every system. And yes, immigration is a trauma.
When Russians arrived in the 90s, Israel was at that point full of people. There wasn't much housing available. So Russians were pushed to the periphery. And many people felt very antagonized by that.
Citizen journalist and blogger Elizabeth Surkov arrived from Petersburg 23 years ago as a toddler. Her parents are first-generation migrants. She and her peers are known as Generation 1.5.
My parents were both political prisoners in the USSR. My father, he was arrested for writing and distributing leaflets against the regime. And for that, he served 7 years in prison and 2 years in hard labor in Siberia. My mother spent 3 years in prison, and therefore we were not allowed to leave when other Jews were let out. As a result, we went to Finland for a month. We went by train. We told authorities that we were just going to visit. We took very little belongings, and our father stayed behind to serve as collateral to ensure that we return. And we chose not to return. We went to the Israeli embassy in Finland, and after a month, we arrived to Israel.
In the early 90s, indigenous Israelis known as Sabras stigmatized the new arrivals. They may have been invited to swell Jewish numbers to match those of the Palestinians, but for the Sabras, they also constituted a threat. Elizabeth's generation had to combat the stereotype of new Russians as indigent drunks and streetwalkers.
The stereotype is definitely still present. I volunteer with the refugees and migrant workers, and mostly in the area of southern Tel Aviv, which is the crime and prostitution hub of Israel. And I pass by brothels, and it is true that all the prostitutes there are Russian, from the former Soviet Union. This is not because we Russian girls have loose morals or want to sell our bodies. It is because the way this wave of immigration was handled. Some people managed to rise in their field, and doctors, for example, managed to do exams and prove that they are real doctors, even though they studied in the USSR and they are practicing as doctors in other professions as well. But many people couldn't find their way in Israel, and they were forced to perform even such horrible jobs. There are kind of new stereotypes that are more positive towards Russian. For example, that Russians are educated and that they work very hard and that they place great importance on education and that they're good with computers and math and chess.
One contentious prospect for Generation 1.5 is offered by the settlements in the occupied territories. We're driving down Route 5. Turn right out of Tel Aviv, cross a checkpoint, and you're in the West Bank. We're on our way to Ariel, not so much a settlement, more a small town. It began as a hilltop encampment for a handful of settlers in 1978. Now it has light and heavy industry, new shopping centres and schools. It's the archetypal fact on the ground, and more than half of its citizens are Russians. If you imagine a settlement as a pioneer camp in the barren hills of Judea, think again. This is a pleasant suburban street, framed by spring blossoms with lemon trees in the back gardens.
Здравствуйте. Dennis Marks. Moshe.
Behind this ivy-covered fence lives sociologist Moshe Keniek, who moved here from Lviv in Ukraine in 1991.
Понятно, что подтекст идеологический, и были ли у меня какие-то особенные политические или идеологические мотивы, сразу скажу, что нет, не было.
I'll start by saying that I didn't have any ideological or political motives, much like most of the Russians who settled in Ariel and, in my opinion, most of the Israelis. I think most people moved here for the same reasons. We're close geographically to the center of the country, the transport is affordable, the places of employment and cultural centers are all within 30 minutes journey. And then you have the climate. It's not as warm or as humid as on the coastal plain. You can actually live here. And on top of that, by the time we bought the house, there was already a sizable Russian-speaking community here. So it's all rather convenient.
Another stereotype bites the dust. Moshe isn't the Zionist settler of journalistic cliché. He isn't an ideologue, he's not even religious. He's firmly secular, like the majority of new Russians. But in a country where religious parties have often held the balance of power, this creates other problems. When Russian-born Dima Motel wanted to marry a Sabra in Haifa, he had to confront the religious establishment. Although he'd had a bar mitzvah and served in the army, they required further proof that he was genuinely Jewish.
You have to come with your parents, with your mom and dad, because Judaism is inherited from your mother. And she has to answer more than a few questions in order to prove her Judaism. You have to answer questions like, how did you celebrate Jewish holidays back in Russia? She was questioned on Yiddish. He tells you to go to the second room where the main judge will give his verdict.
They're all rabbis?
Yes.
So what was the outcome?
I entered the room and they asked me to put a yarmulke on. He asked me if I'm circumcised, which is a private question. We waited a couple of minutes outside. He came out with a paper, and that's it. You are Jewish. Goodbye. Have a nice day. It was all in all, it was 3 hours. But I know that people aren't like myself, go through 6 hours and 8 hours and 2 days and 2 weeks and 2 months. I was really angry because I felt like it was a really invasion into my own personal private life. I didn't have to prove anyone I was anything. And again, I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to get married here. I posted what I felt, what happened actually, on Facebook. I got 99% positive responses. I was interviewed by 2 newspapers, a radio show, and afterwards a parliament member called me and asked me to come to the Knesset to speak about it.
The Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is where the drama of Russian migration is played out. The traditional political parties, secular and religious, had little to offer the million-plus newcomers, particularly when it came to social welfare and employment. So they started their own new parties with new leaders. One of them, Avigdor Lieberman from Moldova, rose to the position of foreign minister. Others joined him on the Israeli right, like the political commentator Eric Elman, born in Kazakhstan.
I believe, and I believe that's because of my own experience, the main reason was the betrayal of the electoral promises by the Labour. The Labour promised very concrete things. And we're talking about the promises in the social and economic sphere. They promised faster integration, they promised homes, they promised jobs, they promised equality, and they didn't deliver any of that for the Russians. So this resentment was the beginning of this estrangement from the Labour and the left in general.
We've just had an election which has turned out not quite the way some people predicted. A lot of things in the landscape has changed. How have the Russians reacted to that change?
The Russian vote is always diverse. One thing that does not surprise is that you will find Russian votes in many parties, from right to left. You will still find the majority of them on the right and center. Of course, you can find Russian-speaking activists there, mostly from younger generation, but the problem was they didn't manage to bring significant numbers of Russian street with them.
I think Russians will continue to identify with the right, and but as the older generation dies out and becomes less influential, there's a room for other voices that are more liberal, people who don't feel the need to prove that we are real Israelis by hating others, by hating Palestinians, by hating Arabs.
Elizabeth Tsurkov again, speaking for the young liberal minority. But they are most definitely a minority.
Back in Ariel's Russian bazaar, life may appear stable and comfortable. Secular Russians are free to eat their pork sausages. Today's Saturday, when the shops in Jerusalem are firmly shut. Here, the Sabbath opening hours are 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. But scratch the surface and you'll quickly remember that you're 17 miles into the West Bank. Ariel is named after the former Premier Sharon, who coined the phrase facts on the ground. For Moshe, these facts offer nothing but benefit to the Palestinians who once cultivated these hills.
Ариэль – это город, который должен быть в этом месте сейчас, через 5, через 10, через 50 лет.
For me, as a political scientist, Ariel is the city that should be where it is today, tomorrow, in 10 years, in 50. Because its existence is in the interests of both the current and future population of this area, including the Arab population, of course. And the Arabs are interested in the development of this city and in the Israeli presence no less than the Jews. There's a university. It's attended not only by the Jews, but also by Israeli Arabs. And Palestinians will attend it in the future too. There are 2 industrial areas within a 5-kilometer radius of Ariel, and in each of them, 50% of the workforce is Palestinian. My wife works in a factory which builds components for anti-missile defense systems. Even that militarily sensitive installation has 50% Palestinian employees, 30% Russians, and 20% Israelis in administrative capacities. For the Arabs here in the territories, Israeli centers of technology, education and employment are powerful factors of development, economics and population. For the Arabs.
Is that really the case? No Palestinians live in Ariel. You won't see them in the Russian supermarket. Nor can they use the gym and the swimming pool in what the Russians call Ariel's country club. Its funding comes from American benefactors, but the water in the pool is diverted from the nearby Palestinian aquifer. For Generation 1.5, it's only one example of the ubiquitous conflicts of contemporary Israel. Moshe may feel confident of his prospects in Ariel, but Russian-born journalist and human rights worker Lisa Rozovsky has a far less rosy view of her own future.
When I think of myself in 10 or 15 years, I'm not sure I'm going to be here. I'm not sure Israel is the place where my children would have the opportunities I want them to have. This country has too much controversies and problems that I really can't see them being solved in the long term, like the Palestinian problem, obviously, the religious and the secular problem. There are lots of groups here who don't really accept each other and who don't really respect each other, and they're not ready to change themselves in order to make this place a more, a better place. Eventually, if it won't change in some cardinal way, it will bring Israel not to a good place.
First-generation liberals like Lily Galili continue to put their faith in Generation 1.5.
We can see this 1.5 generation people now suddenly very active in all kinds of social organizations that they were absolutely not involved in before, and certainly also in political groupings. I see the process of thinking and rethinking that has been closed until now. There is a lot of diversity, so things are changing, and I don't know, of course, how this story is going to end, but I'm glad it began. I'm still very happy with it. And I think that in the long run, well, we are not alone in this story. We have to take into account all the factors in this story. Russians, they are only part of the story, part of a much bigger story.
A bigger story indeed. It goes back to the very beginnings of Zionism in the 1890s, when the Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl imagined the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, as a multicultural rainbow nation. When the state was finally founded 60 years later, its first Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, had a very different vision. Israel would be a melting pot, in which Jews from Western Europe, North Africa, the Levant and beyond would combine to create a new national identity. But have they?
Herzl was saying that all these different flowers have to prosper on our soil. For me personally, this vision of Herzl is much closer to my heart than the vision of the melting pot. There is no type of new Jew. There are Jews who are coming from Russian Jewish culture, and there are Jews who are coming from British Jewish culture, Jews who are coming from American Jewish culture, or from Muslim Jewish culture, and all these cultures together, they are creating one Israeli Jewish culture.
Because it's such a large number of people came, and so suddenly, that they didn't have to assimilate and they didn't want to. People could start their own newspapers and radio stations and maintain their culture and establish cultural associations and even establish their own parties. And in the 90s, people had the choice not to assimilate, they chose not to.
I think this absorption, this immigration, is not only a success, but it borders on a miracle. You have to take into account that proportionally, it's like for the United States of America absorbing all of France and Belgium together.
I first met Russian immigrants here almost 30 years ago. In the 1980s, many of them seemed lost and confused. Returning in the early decades of the 21st century, with Russians in the Knesset, with Russian towns in the desert, with Russian theatre companies and Russian technocrats dominating the new industries, I imagined that confusion would have given way to confidence. But I wonder, how many more generations will it take for the schism between melting pot and rainbow to be resolved? How long before Israelis address the much greater gulf between facts on the ground like Ariel and the people who can't shop in its bazaar and can't swim in its pool?